Hello, this is John Majori with Majori on Bowie.com, and I'm here today with a very special guest, my good friend and former colleague, Melissa DeRosa, best-selling author, political consultant, and somebody who was actually my boss for many years. If you're only familiar with me through the blog, you might not know that my professional career was in government, and Melissa and I served together in the administration of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. And I've been watching Melissa do the rounds of different talk shows talking about her best-selling book, What's Left Unsaid, one of the few books I've ever read three times, and I think the only book I ever read three times within the span of a year. You should go out and get it. Behind me, you see different formats you could get it in. And there's only one thing wrong with the book, and that's that it doesn't mention David Bowie at all. That said, as I've been watching Melissa on different talk shows talking about the book, I realized that her life is like a David Bowie song, or to be more precise, several David Bowie songs. And this is the first interview that I'm really giving a title, which is Something Happened on the Day He Died. And I'm going to frame the different questions I'm going to be asking to Melissa in the context of either Bowie songs or topics that he addressed. If you are a Bowie fan, you're going to get it. If you're a Melissa DeRosa fan, you should be a Bowie fan as well. But if you're not, don't worry about it. We're not going to get into the intricacies of Ziggy Stardust. So, Melissa, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm great, John. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, thank you for coming. So, why don't we start with the beginning, which is the beginning of your career, which was not in politics, but was in fashion. And as Bowie fans will know, Bowie had a song called Fashion that conflates the fashion industry with politics. And I'm wondering if you've seen that. What are the similarities and the differences? How did you go from starting in fashion to becoming a national political figure?
Well, John, it's funny because I always used to joke around that moving from fashion to politics was sort of a lateral move. But I will say, look, my first job out of college was in fashion. As I write in the book, it was sort of an impulsive decision I made during senior week at Cornell University. I had never imagined doing anything but politics. I had sort of been brought up in a very political household, and that had always been my path, including interning in high school for the political director of the AFL-CIO, and then in college for United States Senator Hillary Clinton, who's a great person I look up to, a figure in my life that I've looked up to a long time. And then I sort of make this impulsive decision during senior week when this offer is thrown out to me over beer pong to go work as a fashion publicist. And as I write in the book, my father, sort of sat me down after a year and basically said, are we done yet? Like I wanted you, my mother and I always said, your mother and I always said that we would give you enough to do something, but not enough to do nothing. And we feel like you're doing nothing. And that's unfair to people who work in the fashion industry, because as I write in the book, I mean, the fashion industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry that is art, it's commerce, it's marketing, it's so many things. And it literally is, what we live in day to day. But it's a tough industry. It's absolutely cutthroat. When people think about when the Devil Wears Prada, like that's very much my experience. Hard charging people at the top who are successful because they work relentlessly and they care about every little detail. And if something isn't right, then they're not going to continue to work for you anymore. It's not like a silly industry just because it's clothing. But after that year, my father essentially said, is it over? Yeah. And it was. And I enjoyed every minute of it. I'm so happy I did it because it allowed me to step into a different world for a period of time and give me a different perspective. But it was time to go back to politics and government. So
Yeah. Well, I think we could all be glad that you made that transition. But otherwise, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. But there's another similarity, I think, between fashion and politics, and a topic David Bowie covered and also really embraced, which is artifice. He presented himself often in character, like he was playing out a role in real life. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've observed in politics, the artifice of politics, political theater. How does that come into play in American politics and just in your career?
Well, so much of what we see, particularly today, it's funny because people say they like Trump because he presented authenticity like versus
Yeah,
Hillary, who in 2016 people thought was sort of like so practiced, such a robot, all of these things, when in reality, I think Hillary was told she couldn't be herself by so many people over the years because she wasn't likable enough and she needed to dress a certain way and be a certain way and speak a certain way. And Trump, is sort of the master marketing manipulator. And he really is political theater. I mean, and
yeah,
you saw it in 2016, you saw it in The Apprentice, you see it today, outside of the courthouse every day when he gives these press conferences and when he's going to New Jersey over the weekend and get, engaged in this massive rally. And it's all theater. And it's who you are presenting to the world and what side of you want people to see and what you're saying that's poll tested that resonates. And so I absolutely think, politics and government is the art of political theater, no question, and more so today than ever before.
I made the connection in my mind between Bowie and political theater when I saw an article about Trump casting staff. He wasn't interviewing staff, but he wanted them to have the look, right? He had this idea of what staff members should look like. But I think, you and I both experienced in our professional careers that there's a theatrical or an artificial aspect to politics, but there are also real consequences that affect people's lives. And often those are about issues that can both be addressed in an artistic way, but also in a real life substantive policy way. And one that comes to mind that's relevant to Bowie is a gender identity. So in the, throughout his career, but starting in the early 70s, he addressed gender ambiguity and gender identity through his art, not as a political issue. He wasn't advocating for political change. But we were part of an administration, and I should say that neither of us were at the forefront of this particular issue, but we're both very proud that the administration we were part of legalized marriage equality in New York State back in 2011. And at the time, that was enormously consequential and controversial. And today, it's not controversial anymore. But in the ensuing years, gender identity has taken the forefront in terms of a political issue. And I'm wondering about your observation about how did that happen? Do you have any thoughts about how the evolution of culture sort of tease up what's politically possible, and where do you see that going as an issue?
Well, and John, just to back up first to some of what you were saying, which I think is totally dead on. I mean, there's politics, government by performance, but
Yeah,
government by performance doesn't impact people. It is literally just theater. And I
yeah,
think so much of what you see in government and politics today is politics and government by performance. And it's seeking a headline without any substance beneath it when you scratch just beneath the surface. And it's, pronouncing victory on something, even though like that victory may matter for you politically because you can say you're a winner, but then doesn't actually have any impacts on real people. And you see that at the federal level, you see it at the state level, you see it at the local level. And it's sort of led to this degradation of government and politics where people just don't believe in anything anymore. And
yeah,
they think that it's all, BS. And then on top of it, sort of the media, who is supposed to play the role of referee and calling balls and strikes, has, been so degraded over the years, combination of budget cuts, you're not investing in real talent, you don't have older, more experienced people, you're hiring these young kids who really don't know what the hell they're talking about and don't know that they don't know what they're talking about. And in combination with, I think, the editorializing, which has now seeped into news, which is when news became a money-making business, all of a sudden you have alternative facts. It's not alternative opinions, it's alternative facts presented depending on which news outlet you're seeking out. And so all of those things together have led to, if you want to see that Donald Trump is terrible, watch MSNBC every morning and you will see all the commentators giving the greatest performances of their life, sometimes going to great lengths to make a case that doesn't really exist. And same thing when you go on Fox News. And so that's absolutely everything you were saying is profound and right and so important for people to sort of internalize, because if we don't figure out a way to break that cycle I'm afraid that we're at the beginning of the end of this form of government that we're in, because it's just
Yeah.
collapsing around us. On the gender identity, Andrew Cuomo takes office in 2011, and I wasn't working for the administration. I was working in the Attorney General's office. Although when he got marriage equality done, that was one of the things I remember sort of watching from the sidelines and jealously saying, I want to be part of that.
Yeah.
But he took office in 2011, and Republicans were in charge of the state Senate. And, he set out pretty early on to say, this is going to be a priority for me, and I'm going to get this done in New York. And what people don't remember is that the year before, in 2010, David Paterson was governor. So Democrat governor, there was a Democratic assembly and there was a Democratic Senate, not by a small margin. Like, Democrats decisively had control of the state Senate, and they put marriage equality on the floor, and it went up in flames. It didn't require a single Republican vote, and it went up in flames. And so when Andrew Cuomo comes in 2011 and says, I'm going to get this done, there was, a lot of warranted skepticism about whether or not that could become a reality. And I think that he understood the moment that we were in, where there was a little bit of the tide turning and that people were becoming more accepting. And, he got everybody in a room, all the advocates in a room, and essentially said, like, you're not all going to go do your own individual campaigns and sometimes work at odds. We're all going to work together. We're going to all, march to the same tune, and we're going to do it at the same pace, and it's going to be strategic, and we're going to use the levers that we have available to us in order to move the pieces on the board. And he very methodically went out and got those votes. And, I think that he understood and in doing so, he got 4 Republicans to vote for gay marriage. He needed 2, but he knew he would never get it passed with 2, because no one wanted to be able to say that they were the reason that that vote passed. So he needed the extra 2 votes. So it wasn't as if someone could just say, if but for you, there wouldn't be gay marriage in the state, because politically it was just unpalatable.
Yeah.
And so he went out and got those 2 extra cushioned votes. And you went from the year before, where Democrats didn't pass this, to getting it done with the Republican Senate with room to spare. And so it was really incredible, but it took, dogged pursuit. It took 6 months of, press conferences and lining everybody up and making the public case as to why New York should lead and why the moment was now, and doing polling and being able to show that you could sway public opinion in a way that made it not as politically fraught. He went out and spoke to people's family members and got the family members to lobby their own parents to vote for the bills, the legislators. And it was really, when I think back on politics and government, the closest thing I can compare it to was LBJ
Yeah.
getting the civil rights bill done. Or, when you even look back to, for people who've seen the movie Lincoln, when he was picking off votes in the 1860s to overturn slavery. And it was that sort of single-minded, strategic, dogged pursuit of something that mattered. And ultimately, after New York voted to make marriage equality a reality, we were the first big state in the country, the Supreme Court subsequently took it up, and they cited New York's move to legalize marriage equality in the case to say it was unconstitutional to ban, same-sex marriages. And
Over.
so, yeah, so
Yeah.
the impact that New York had, and that the legislature had, and Andrew Cuomo had, and it wouldn't have happened without him, right? It didn't
Yeah.
happen before. He gets the credit for that. Our administration gets the credit for that. And the consequences of that was that it changed the course of the nation in accepting marriage equality. And so government, when it's not about performance, when government is actually about substance and real people, which is what it's supposed to be there for, not personal egos, but the people you're serving, the effects that it can have, the impact it has on lives of the people it serves, has no bounds. And unfortunately, I think we've now become a debating society of why you're right and I'm wrong, and I'm going to stop everything you want to do on principle.
Yeah.
And even in cases, in New York, where you have the Democrats in control of the city council, the mayor's office, the state legislature, the governor's office, so much of what they're doing is not only not going to help anyone, but it actually down the line will end up, I think, hurting the state of New York fiscally and in other ways. And so it's just a sad situation to think back on where things were not that long ago, 13 years ago, to where we are today.
Yeah, I'm not going to single anybody out, but do you think that we're experiencing a dynamic where some, not everyone, but some of the leaders of our party um, are think it's enough to be for or against something without actually making something happen? And one of the dangers of the other party is that nobody believes that they're going to actually do what they're saying they're going to do.
100%. I mean, you just nailed it. And so it's all become about sort of political posturing. I was joking to somebody, I was watching a politician who I actually really like on Twitter this morning, tweeting out, like, we will always protect the Constitution. The other side wants tyranny. And I like sent the tweet to a friend in the press. And I was like, it's hard to believe that these pithy tweets aren't, impacting those polls in the swing
Yeah,
states. I mean, and it's tongue in cheek, but it's like we've been so reduced to just saying what you're for and what the other side is against and not actually delivering anything. And it's what fits in a sound bite, and there's just a real lack of substance.
yeah. So I started by mentioning marriage equality, which is an issue that I was really on the periphery of within the administration, and you weren't in the administration yet, but shortly thereafter you joined the administration, and you quickly rose to the position of secretary to the governor, which is the equivalent of the president's chief of staff. It's the top job in the administration and the top non-elected job in the state government. And you quickly, normally secretaries of the governor are known within state government and known within Albany, but not national political figures. But that didn't stay the case for you, because you found yourself thrust at really the eye of the storm of the COVID pandemic. And I'm mentioning this for a couple of reasons, one of which is 50 years before that happened, Bowie was writing songs about dystopian visions of the breakdown of society. And one of the themes he covered throughout the duration of his career was isolation. And so during the worst days and weeks and months of the pandemic, we were experiencing a dystopia. And during and as a result, we've become more isolated as people. And I'm wondering if you could talk about your experience really at the center, not just of the state's response, but really of the national response to this crisis, and any thoughts you might have on how we get beyond the sense of isolation that's a hangover from that period.
It was bizarre, is the only way to describe it. I mean, you take these jobs, if you're a staff person, regardless of how senior you are, at least in state government, it's a different thing at the federal level. But you didn't put your name on the ballot, you didn't run for anything, you didn't choose to be in the spotlight. And then all of a sudden the COVID briefings start. And we would joke to reporters and say we weren't doing anything differently than we had been doing for, the entirety of the administration. It's just all of a sudden the nation was watching. We used to do those red room press conferences all the time on various issues. The governor was always infamous for his PowerPoints, within the Albany sort of bubble in the press. And all of a sudden, we were just thrust onto the national stage, and we were providing, I think, what people needed in that moment, which was reliable information, fact-driven sort of analysis of what was going on, mixed in with some real emotion and empathy. And the reaction people had to those press conferences was unlike anything I could have ever anticipated. And it was one thing when, the governor, this term Cuomo-sexual was born, and he's on the cover of Rolling Stone like an actual rock star, while he's actually a governor of the state of New York and had been for the decade prior. And all these women want to date him, all this stuff. But then all of a sudden I'm starting to get sort of barraged with fan mail, and a lot of women who were saying that they look up to me, and little girls saying they want to be like me, and men who want to date me. And it was, all of a sudden I'm on the cover of Harper's Bazaar, and the New York Times style section is profiling me. And I write about in the book, there's a moment when I'm going out to lunch with a friend, after outdoor dining opened in the city. We're sitting outside in New York City at a table, and the waitress, sort of double takes and recognizes me and
Yeah,
gushes and asks to take a photo. And
you're
it
actually getting
was
into
surreal.
the territory of another question I wanted to ask, which is, fame. Bowie had a hit song called Fame, which really reflected on his own experience. you're the only person, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to sort of set this up. You're the only person I know that had a Godzilla-sized billboard in Times Square. You didn't put it up. You were the subject of it. Multiple magazine covers, magazine spreads. You've become a celebrity, but I've been with you when people have asked for your autograph or wanted a picture with you. You're invited on national TV shows, CNBC. You're invited to do guest columns and appear on talk shows. So from the experience of managing COVID, what has your experience been? And you started to go down this road, but I just sort of wanted to frame it. Experiencing fame, is it thrilling? Is it annoying? What has that been like?
No, I mean, look, it was surreal at first, in those days when we were sort of at our height. And then it was, I mean, it was terrible. It was, when the administration was starting to be taken down in 2021 and through that period, and I was literally being stalked by the paparazzi, and I didn't know that they were hiding in bushes outside of my family's homes. And, all of a sudden there are like Daily Mail pieces that are popping up to, taking photos of me I didn't know were being taken. And I sort of developed this sense of like this feeling of paranoia for a period of time, that anywhere I went, I was wearing a baseball cap. I didn't know if someone recognized me, if someone was secretly like taking a photo of me. And it was terrible. I mean, it was, when the highs are high, it's one thing, although bizarre. And then, when the lows are low, it's terrible. And, when you experience that level of fame, it's not, it's not all great, right? All of a sudden you've got a big target on your back and people want to go after you. And there's people who, genuinely oppose your views. There are people who are jealous of you. There are people who want to take you down for their own personal reasons. And all of a sudden you're being, I write about this in the book, this reporter from New York Magazine, Rebecca Traister, who wrote this 10,000 word missive about the administration from Maine. Like, she was living in Maine. She had never met anyone. She didn't
Yeah,
know anybody. She was dealing entirely with sources who had their own personal and political motivations. She wrote things within her piece that were contradicted by other things in her piece. And when you're reading things like that and you have an out of body experience, and you're like, who the hell is this person? But, they have a platform and they can write whatever they want about you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so, it is surreal. It's bizarre. I, got to a certain point when I decided to write the book where, my family was saying to me, are you sure you want to talk about your marriage this openly? Are you sure you want to talk about, some of the trauma you endured, be this honest about some of the mental health struggles you were dealing with during COVID? Because I was. And I said, look, like, the choice of whether or not like these parts of my life to be in the public were taken from me. I didn't decide, but the New York Post did, when they wrote about my marriage and when other things were reported in the press. And I said, essentially, like, it's already out there. Like, I just want to take my life back. And it's a very strange thing. And I have other friends in this space, who experienced similar things, who I've had conversations with, where it's a very bizarre thing to have people approach you, tweet about you, write about you as if they know you when they have not the first idea in the world.
yeah,
And then at a certain point, I think that and I'm at this place now where, when Rebecca Traister writes the hit piece about my book, I can take a step back and say, this isn't about me. This is about her. She has
yeah,
her own motivations. She has her own, she has her own desire to defend her original work and not be willing to admit that she was wrong when she was very clearly wrong. And that's been borne out. But I'm not going to let it bother me. If anything,
yeah,
I'm like, I guess she's writing about it. Great. It'll sell more books. So, at a certain point, I crossed that Rubicon and was able to divorce the emotion from the criticism, but it took a really long time.
yeah. Just jumping back, you touched on this, but in your book you have anecdotes about during this crisis when you would show up at the state capitol and you couldn't go home. You were living out of a hotel that in normal times is a nice hotel, but I don't think it was for you at that time. And you were experiencing what a lot of people were, which was this sense of isolation. And you took steps in your life to emerge from that. And some of those steps had to happen after the vaccine came out. But can you just talk a little bit about, some of what you wrote about that again, that sense of isolation, and then just a little bit about what you did to emerge from that. And then I'm going to come back and ask you about something else you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, there was once sort of everything fell apart in 2021 for our administration. I disappeared. Went to my family, my sister's family has a house in Cape Cod. I went there. I sort of disappeared for a few months. I saw you at one point during
Yeah,
that period. We met for dinner. But other than that, and our other dear friend and colleague, Stephanie, I really didn't see anyone for a few
yeah,
months within family. And as I said, and I think you saw even that night when we met, I was wearing like a baseball cap. Like I was still sort of like skulking around and didn't want to be seen and needed, a little bit of time and space. But then, I made the decision to write the book. I made the decision that, politics, like so much of life is like boxing. If you're going to be in the ring, you're going to get punched in the face, and you've got to expect that. The question is, what do you do when you hit the mat? Do you get back up? And
yeah,
I decided that I was going to keep fighting, and that I was going to take my life back. I was going to write my book. I was going to go out there and make sure my voice was heard. I was going to influence the conversation. I was going to weigh in on policy and politics. And I wasn't done. I could have gone to Paris and eaten cheese and drank wine and shopped, I guess. I could have gone into a different industry, could have just started over. I could have decided I wanted to remove myself entirely from the public eye. But to do that would have been to, let them win. And I
yeah,
wasn't going to let them win. And so, it was a long, painful process. In a lot of ways, it felt like two steps forward, one step back, but you just keep going forward. But I was committed to doing it and I did it. And I hope if there's anything people take from the book, it's sort of that feeling of life is going to knock you down. It's going to be a scandal. It's going to be a divorce. It's going to be infertility. It's going to be betrayal. It's going to be a pandemic. Who knows? Whatever those things are in your own life. Everyone it deals with adversity. Everyone deals with defeat. Everyone deals with being knocked down in some form. And the question is, what do you do in those moments? And I hope that if people take anything away, it's the value of standing up and keep going.
yeah. I'm going to ask you one other question about coming back, which we were just addressing. But before we do that, an unpleasant episode that we kind of skipped, and there's a phenomena that emerged, in the years since Bowie passed away in 2016. That there's the Me Too movement, and then there's a term that I'm going to use that I hate, but I don't know the better way of putting it: the cancel culture phenomena. And this is relevant to Bowie in the sense that um, there are literally books about whether or not we can still listen to David Bowie because uh, after he died, two women wrote their own reminiscence of him and said that they lost their virginity to him when they were underage. And so, especially in the British press, but there's a book called Monsters where the writer really struggles with, can I bring myself to listening to David Bowie? And um, you know, these phenomena sort of touched our lives as well. Where I think it's not too much of an exaggeration to say we're not working together professionally for reasons related to the Me Too movement and cancel culture. And without getting into all the specific details, it's just what's your observation about that, and where do you think those two, for lack of a better term, movements are today? Like what happened over the last few years?
The Me Too movement, I think, was a necessary corrective whereby, there was sort of an exposure of the power imbalance women in this country have faced since the beginning of time. And, it started with Harvey Weinstein. There was the Access Hollywood tape with Trump where you heard a guy who became president of the United States say what he said, that celebrities are entitled to grab women solely because they're celebrities. And I think it was a necessary corrective and a crucial conversation to have bubble to the forefront. But I think it has been so distorted, so manipulated, so weaponized at this point. And it's interesting, the Harvey Weinstein rape conviction in New York was overturned recently, not because the judge is saying it didn't happen, but because the judges declared that the process of the trial was conducted unfairly and not accordance to the law. And so he is entitled under law to have a new trial. And I thought that the response to that was so telling in how muted it was.
Yeah,
I thought maybe there would be a women's march that weekend. I thought women would flood to the streets. I didn't think. I wondered if. I
yeah,
wondered where is this going to go? And nothing. There was a press conference held by a couple of celebrities, and the woman who founded the Me Too movement, where they expressed their outrage at what the judge had done. There was one day of news stories, and that was kind of it.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting because I talk to men who are, professionals, CEOs, people who are tops of businesses who say, I'm not hiring women in their 20s. I'm not. It's like an employment liability. If I look at them the wrong way, I could get sued. If, they perceive an offhand comment a certain way, I could find myself in a lawsuit. And it's they're just Me Too, where it lost its way, I think, and I write about this in the book at the end in sort of my reflections, is that not everything is rape. Not everything is Harvey Weinstein. You
Yeah.
know, a kiss on the cheek is just a kiss on the cheek. And we have evolved as a culture to where if you get a kiss on the cheek and you don't want to kiss on the cheek, say you don't want to be kissed on the cheek, more power to you. Set your own boundaries. But that doesn't mean the person that kissed you on the cheek, which in 90% of the world is an accepted form of greeting, that the person who did that should be fired, canceled, ostracized. And some things require an apology. Some things require training if perhaps there's chronic behavior that's out of step with the time. Some things you should be fired, and some you should go to jail. But the Me Too movement took all of those things and put them in one bucket, and it's not taken seriously anymore. It's
Yeah.
just not. And it's funny, the people who have read my book have said to me, I read the book, and at the time I couldn't really tell what was going on with the governor. And now I think to myself, he had to step down for that.
Yeah.
And, I think that the Me Too movement at the time was an important conversation starter. I think for a lot of people's own, and for a lot of the media's own, motivations, it has been so distorted that I think at the end of the day, this chapter in time may end up being written that it set the women's movement back.
Yeah.
I think cancel culture, I think people associate cancel culture with the left wing of the Democratic Party. And I think a lot of what you're seeing right now in the middle and the moderates going with Republicans, even when that means someone as extreme as Trump, I think it's a reaction to cancel culture and people being so sick of it. People are over it. Everyone knows someone who has been accused of something or has been canceled or who has been fired or something, and people are sick of it. And so I think it all went too far. I think it's not the first time a cultural movement has been distorted and weaponized. But it's interesting because I think that this period in time, when we look back on it, is going to have set the things people care about backwards.
Yeah. And I think there's an irony to that. Having worked with you, you were the driver on actual legislation that moved all of those things forward. I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but you were either the driver or a driver in changing the laws about reporting sexual abuse on campus, codifying Roe versus Wade in New York state law at a time when people said that's performative, it will never be necessary. Roe versus Wade is settled law. Um, Human trafficking, there was a 11-point, it was called Women's Agenda, and I think you were the driver on seeing those 11 pieces of legislation passed into law. And for, as I, it's a whole other discussion, but Melissa's discussion of it in her book is reason enough to buy the book and read it, because it's really fascinating. So I see there being an irony there. You mentioned you hit a low point after the administration collapsed, and you started coming back. And I think your book, the Bowie equivalent, is his album The Next Day, and his song, which was a surprise. It was the first anybody had heard of him for 10 years, which was called Where Are We Now? So let me take that title and ask you, where are you now?
Honestly, I'm the happiest I've ever been.
Yeah.
And it's life is funny. You live through things, you think things are never going to get better. You live through other things, you think there's no way things can get worse. You live through various moments where you think nothing can be topped, and then you get to the other side of it. And I think having experienced what I experienced, I have such perspective on what's important. And I spend time in my life now with the people I want to spend time with. You know what I don't say yes to? Anything I don't want to.
Yeah.
You know, I choose the clients I want based on the people who I'll be working with and the issues that I care about. I go on television and talk about things, whether they upset people in my own party or not, because I believe in them. And there is a certain freeing that comes along with being at the point that I'm at in my life. And, you know, saying it's like, what are you going to do to me? Like, you've done everything you can do to me, and coming out on the other end of it. And it's incredibly liberating. And so, where am I in my life? I am doing consulting, I'm doing writing. As you mentioned, I'm doing some national television, I do radio. I'm doing the things I care about and I love, and I'm giving myself time and space to say, maybe not today I'm getting back in the ring, but I know someday. And,
Yeah.
you know, in between now and then, I'm going to spend all the time that I have with the people I love, because I know you go back, you lose that freedom. But so that's where I am. And it's great and it's wonderful. And I never thought that I would end up here. And so, you know, for people who are watching this, listening to this, who are maybe at a low point, just keep going, because the other side is better. And then you have time and space, and the reflections and the lessons learned help shape how you go forward in a way that will improve your life.
Yeah. Well, Melissa, you're an incredibly accomplished person who is still at a very young age. And I've said this to you personally, but I'll say it to everyone who's watching this. You haven't yet done what you're going to be remembered for. So I'm looking forward to what comes next for you. But I'm going to end this interview with a question I ask everybody, which brings it back to David Bowie, which is, what is your favorite Bowie song and album?
Okay, so I will admit that I'm not the most avid Bowie listener, but it is definitely Let's Dance, which I was listening to right before this interview, and honor you, John Jory. And it's just a fun song to listen and sing to and listen to in the car. So Let's Dance is my choice.
Great, wonderful. Okay, Melissa DeRosa, buy her book. You see, you can get it a hard copy, an electronic copy, any way you read books, you could get her book. If you haven't read it yet, buy it. It's terrific. And thank you very much for joining me today on this interview. And I look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks, John.